Hey, welcome to the newest session of Academic Crisis Line. Today we are going to talk about how to write a letter to the editor when submitting an article to a journal. As usual, use the YouTube chat function on the right side to ask questions during the whole session. Keep in mind that you're like half a minute delayed, so don't wait too long to ask your questions and just type it up right away when it comes to you. Other than that, you can also ask questions by tweeting to @phdial or send me a direct message. I will try to answer all your questions which you have. And also in general, if you have questions, you can tweet to me. Or if this doesn't work for you, you can just write me an email, fhartung@upenn.edu. So you're also welcome to submit questions, remarks, suggestions for new sessions, or relentless critique to my email. I might read it, I might not read it, but if you're nice, I try to answer. For today's sessions, I also prepared a template you can download, plus some additional resources. This is in the description of this video. There's a link to my website where I wrote a blog post for today's session with a mini summary already. But let's now talk a bit about the contents. I hope you have the template already at hand, or you can look at it later. It doesn't really matter. It's just a helpline to see, for you to figure out what should be in there and what the purpose of this is. Disciplines differ widely in what is conventional and what not, and in some disciplines, it's actually considered very bad taste to submit such a letter in the first place. In psychology and cognitive neuroscience, this is not the case, so I've never submitted an article to a journal without writing an editor letter. And unless there is a very, very strong stigma against doing this, or you shouldn't do this in the first place because nobody does it and it's considered bad taste, but it's still obligatory and not everybody does it, I still recommend you to do it because it can actually be helpful. And the main goal of such a letter is to help the editor process your manuscript in the right way and to already streamline the processing of your manuscript. By highlighting what your manuscript is about or what article type it is and whatever, and giving all the relevant information and communicating the main selling point of your article and why you think it should be published in the journal, this can help tremendously the editor to make a fast decision on first whether it's interesting for the journal in the first place, whether it's realistic to find reviewers, whether it's interesting for his readership and his journal, but also who might be the ideal action editor to process the manuscript and which reviewers it should be sent out to and how, or whether there is actually an upcoming special issue on a very similar topic which you might consider submitting to. So it's always good to have this information communicated and not force the editor to read through your entire manuscript to figure out what it's all about and like how to process it. First, I don't think this is necessarily the editor's job, especially the managing editor whose job is just to streamline it to an action editor. But on the other hand, it also just helps making a faster decision, and you don't get on this pile of work people won't be able to do until in a few weeks. So do yourself a favor and just write it. But if you write it and you have decided on a journal you want to submit your article to, the first step is to check the guidelines for authors and see whether there's any information given on how to write such a letter and what information should be contained in a letter. If journals have information on this, they usually also have a list of statements which have to be included in this letter by legal means, and always, by all means, always follow these instructions. And if the instructions are against anything I'm saying here today, then please follow the instructions on the guidelines for authors and disregard everything I say today. All right. So the minimum you should have in a letter to the editor, if you decide to write one, and if this is common practice, and there are no other instructions given, which override what I'm saying now, is you write something like, here's my submission, including your article title and what type of article it is. Make sure it fits the journal's convention, some call Like there are often specific article types which are for a specific journal, like brief reports or original research article or review article, whatever. So journals always have very specific conventions, and make sure that you select the right one for your article and that your article also fits all the requirements for this type of submission. The other thing which is really important is an originality statement, which means you have to write one sentence which says that this is original work which you haven't copied somewhere, that it's not under consideration for publication somewhere else, and that this is a first submission to this journal. Or if it's a second submission or a resubmission, then also state this. And also, most importantly, and often forgotten, your contact information. At least an email address, if not like your full affiliation. So in terms of the content, I think it's always good to write what the article is about, what the main contribution to the field is, what exactly has been done, and what you found, and to clearly communicate what your core argument or your core finding is. But most importantly, and this is something which is often a bit taken too easily, is tell the editor why it is important that he or she publishes your article in their journal. So obviously something like, oh, I need a high impact publication and I really think this could fit this work is not a good reason. So try to communicate like what gap in the literature your article fills and how this relates to previous publications in this journal, and how your article ties in with other research there and how it's important for the readership. For example, keep in mind the editor has an interest in having good high impact articles which are going to be cited a lot because it's relevant for the people reading the journal. This is the main interest of the editor. And of course, it's also about scientific reputation. So the editor wants to have relevant work and well done work. These are the main reasons. In terms of style, I've seen funny things, but I think given that most journals I submit to and you submit to probably too are very much based and centered in the Western academic culture, including Europe and North America, I think it's smart, unless you submit to a journal which is not within that culture, it's smart to follow general conventions there. And this means be concise, be brief, and be extremely professional. This means no flattery. It's something really, really odd if you read a sentence like your esteemed journal or your highly respected journal or something like this. Or dear esteemed editor or something like this. Don't do this, it's weird. Nobody does this. Also, keep in mind that unless you're submitting to a very specific journal, the editor might not be a peer within your specific subdiscipline. So keep jargon to an absolute minimum, ideally no jargon at all. And just communicate the big picture message in everyday language. You only want to have like one big short statement of what the relevance and your finding is. And you don't want to overcomplicate methods and go into technical details. You can do this like partially in the abstract and certainly in your manuscript in discussion with the reviewers, but the editorial letter, the letter to the editor is not the place to do this. Only use standard abbreviations. Standard abbreviations are not specific brain area abbreviations, but things like fMRI or for example. So also write it from scratch and don't copy from sentences from the abstract or something which is already somewhere in your article. No matter how good this one sentence is, the redundancy first will read weird if the next thing they read is your abstract. But the other thing is it's also just the wrong level. You really want to have a very general level how you would sell your manuscript to industry or like how you would sell your research finding to your friends who don't understand all the specifics of your subdiscipline. So keep this on this level that you communicate it to an academic but non-specialist peer. I think it's always a good idea to relate it to the published work in a journal already, and explain how your work relates to previous research on the topic, but avoid name dropping. This is really bad taste, and it's not a good thing to do. And best case, it doesn't hurt you. Worst case, it does. So I wouldn't do it. I think it's also a very bad idea to over-embellish your research or to oversell it. Like things like, for the first time, like unless this is really for the first time, you invented something from scratch and like this has never done before, I would just not do it. And just rather say something like how this answers a question which has been open or which has not been addressed before, or how this explains a mechanism which has been questionable or clarifies a certain setting. So yeah, I would rather write something like this than for the first time I revealed the meaning of the universe or something like this. Like unless you can actually deliver that kind of novelty, just don't promise things you can't hold. And another thing is, even if you know the editor really well and you already had previous communication, which has been maybe not as formal, still this letter is a very formal document and you don't want to have like too intimate expressions or references. And certainly this is not a place for jokes. As you can see in the template also, there are no jokes at all and the level is very professional, so keep this in mind. But yeah, and apart from this, just communicate clearly, this is my article, I think this is really important and answers important questions in this manuscript, in this area of research. I think it fits the readership because there's this general interest as shown by publications here, this, and this. And finally, I can answer a question and this is relevant and I think this is of interest to the readership of your journal. Happy to answer all of your questions. Here's the list of all the legal statements which I found on the guideline for authors page. These statements are usually either regarding originality, conflict of interest. Often you also declare funding sources. Also, often you have to say whether you had previous interaction with the editor or the journal office. Like sometimes when you send an abstract and an inquiry, whether they would be interested in publishing this, then you should say this with your actual submission in the letter to the editor as well. You should also have a sentence in there regarding the authorship. For example, that all of the authors approve of the current version of the manuscript and to submit it to this particular journal. And yeah, I think the letter to the editor is usually signed by the corresponding author. I leave this up for discussion because there is wide range in conventions regarding who the corresponding author should be. But I think the corresponding author should always sign this letter on behalf of all co-authors. Or if there are multiple corresponding authors or like main authors, for example, there's a PhD student who wrote a manuscript and a supervisor who closely supervised it and a bunch of other people who did only parts of the research. Then the two most involved people, like for example, the supervisor and the PhD student, can also both be corresponding author, like at least in a correspondence with the editor and the reviewers. This is also a place where you can maybe mention reviewers who would the manuscript rather not to be sent out to, but state reasons for this. Often if you have an electronic journal submission, there are specific fields for this, so this might be just copied out and pasted in one specific field for excluding reviewers. I think you should maybe give reasons for this. Otherwise, you run the risk that the editor decides to not take care of your opinion and rather submits it there where you don't want it to, just out of principle. You should always have a statement that this is an original submission and that you don't submit the manuscript at the same time for other journals and that you have it under review there. And For some modern journals and open access journal, this is also the place where you can inquire or ask for a publication fee waiver for the open access fee, or you can state that you don't have funding for the publication or the open access fee, but that you would like to have this open access, and whether this is something you could talk about with the editor. For these things, I usually would also write an email before whether there is something, unless there's specific information on the website of the journal. Lastly, before you sign the manuscript, then there's also, for some disciplines, and again, psychology and cognitive neuroscience, I've never seen it otherwise, but there's a lot of controversy whether this is bad taste or not. And this is suggesting people who might be good potential reviewers for this manuscript. And they should have, if you do this, and make sure and ask in your circles and around whether this is something you should do or you shouldn't do. So if you do this and you suggest a list of people who review your article for a journal, this is also sensitive in whom you can suggest. Obviously, you should suggest people who are experts in at least part of what your manuscript is about, be it methods or be it the research topic itself. So they should have actually the capability of giving an objective, good critique and good feedback to your manuscript. But on the other hand, you also don't want people to be too close to you. So I think in general, like people within your institute or neighboring institutes or very close institutes are an absolute no-no. And other things, like everybody you have some kind of relationship with, like former supervisor, your mother, your boyfriend or girlfriend, also absolutely no-nos. Like people who somehow have an interest with you personally or you have some kind of relation with, I wouldn't suggest. And also general, even if you feel completely confident that this person can still be objective, because like it's this professor from this neighboring university and you only talked once, it still looks weird if you only suggest people who are in your immediate geographical circle, whether you have a relationship to them or not. So yeah, I think this is the most important stuff I have to say for now. There are now the opportunities to ask questions. And I also quickly check whether somebody was tweeting me. In the meantime, while you decide whether you want to type a question or not, I want to make a few announcements. First of all, please continue to suggest new topics for this series and vote for topics which are up for vote. On my website, the Academic Crisis Line, just follow the link down there and go to the header Academic Crisis Line. You find the link to the survey. So this is the first thing. Please continue doing this and give me feedback. The other thing, in 2 weeks from now, I have a very exciting session which I would like to announce now already, and this is going to be on gender bias in academia. And I have a very exciting panel including Asle Ozurek from the MPI in the Radboud University in Nijmegen. She's a PI in Gesture and Language Sciences. Emily Koderi, who just started her new lab in the University of Vermont. Yoad Kenneth, who is here a postdoc colleague from me at UPenn, and Atsuka Takashima, who is a former colleague and senior researcher, who is now at the Donders Institute for Brain Cognition and Behavior in the Netherlands. So we have a really exciting panel, and we're going to talk about a lot of things about gender bias, and I assume this is going to be a big session, and there's going to be a lot of discussion. So please don't miss out on that one. And lastly, I'm going to be in Boston over the long weekend now for CNS. If you want to meet up in person or have questions, just write me an email and see whether we can find a time we can grab a coffee or something. So I think today's session was relatively clear. I probably wouldn't have questions otherwise. If you still have questions, just write me an email, and I try to find a time to answer it directly. And so far, stay safe through the snowstorm, East Coast fellows, and everybody else. I hope the start in the spring is going to be soon. Talk to you soon.